So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we think about where we are in our practice um, and what expectations we hold. So periodically I like to read the stories about the 12th century master Geshe Kungel, bin Kungel, who was renowned for his goodness and integrity. So there's two very short stories that I'll read that are often helpful to my mind. So here's the first one. One day, Geshe Kungel was expecting a visit from a large number of his benefactors. That morning, he arranged the offerings on his shrine in front of the images of the three jewels particularly neatly. Examining his intentions, he realized that they were not pure and that he was only trying to impress his patrons. So he picked up a handful of dust and threw it all over the offerings, saying, "Monk, just stay where you are and don't put on airs." When Padma Sangye heard this story, he said, "That handful of dust that Geshe bin Kungel threw was the best offering in all of Tibet." So this is really a good example of how important our intention or motivation is in whatever we do. That's the most important. And how Geshe Kungel worked with this, it's like, he did a do-over or a course correction in the moment. Very, very helpful. The second story then. As a youngster, Geshe Ben Kungel had a reputation for being wild and unruly. But by watching his mind closely all the time and judging it with complete honesty, he gradually got better. So there's hope. Geshe Kungel hadn't eaten for days. A householder invited him inside to be fed as he roamed the streets on that particular day. He was seated respectfully in a room, and the host went off to the kitchen to prepare food for him. The room was bare except for a jar of food on the shelf beside where he sat. Time passed slowly, and the expectation that he was finally going to eat made his stomach growl with eager anguish. Geshe was so hungry that he found it difficult to wait. His eyes kept returning to the jar of food within his reach. Obviously, he couldn't take the food from the jar himself without it first being offered to him by his host. But the host was nowhere to be seen. He was alone in the room. Yearning for food was beginning to cloud his mind. His mouth watered, yet his throat hurt from empty swallows. His fingers trembled, his intestines grumbled. Seconds turned into minutes, minutes into hour. The waiting was made worse by the delicious smell of food cooking in the kitchen that wafted into his nostrils. To his complete shock, he found himself stealing food from the jar. Geshe Ben Kungel suddenly burst out in loud cries of, "Thief, thief! I've caught you red-handed." The hosts rushed into the room to find him berating himself and threaten his hand being cut off if it ever behaved like that again. So these stories are very helpful in keeping my mind in perspective, I think. And there's a few things that I take from these kinds of stories. The first, I think, is if a renowned Geshe is working with such coarse afflictions, what actually am I expecting of myself? Is it realistic? Is my motivation to appear to have tamed my mind? Or is it to recognize my afflictions, take responsibility for them, and work at applying antidotes to turn the mind? So reading these stories helps me to keep my practice in perspective. If I accept my mind is untamed and will be for quite a while, then I am more likely to notice and accept when the mind is afflicted. If I start focusing more on applying antidotes to afflictions instead of blaming others, feeling sorry for myself, letting the self-centered attitude really take over the mind, then my practice goes well. Now, it does get tricky when my afflicted actions are more subtle. Like, for example, when my motivation is mixed. I may start out with a clear motivation, but attachment to reputation seeps in, and now my motivation has morphed into a worldly concern. This is a critical point in which to apply an antidote. And if I don't, what I'm doing is strengthening my ability to practice the 8 worldly concerns, which certainly just leads to more misery. So it is so important to check carefully our motivations to make sure they are not mixed. And when we find they're mixed, at least when I find mine are mixed, what I do is I stop. I don't keep going forward. And I work on my mind. And so whatever I was planning to do, it doesn't happen then. And of course, my mind is very untamed, so oftentimes I'll, do something and then after the fact see, that it was a messy motivation. It wasn't clear at all. So I think the other thing to take from these stories is that, at least for me, at my level, where my practice is that my mind is very untamed. I make mistakes. And it'll be very messy and very painful. That's what happens. And so that's what I get to work with, the mess and the pain. And of course, it's really not a problem. The problem comes when I expect myself to do everything perfectly, do it all by myself, and that I can control the outcomes. That's the problem. So I try to accept afflictions as they arise. Acceptance is really, that's been so helpful this last couple years for me, to accept where I am. And to kind of lean into that. If I don't remember to do that, then my attention is outward, always externally referenced, who's messing with me, who's, trying to, give me trouble, blah, blah, all of that. So these stories give us the example of that this path is long. It takes a long time, and I'm going to be inhabiting this messy mind this lifetime without a doubt. And so let me accept that and let me work with what arises. There are a bazillion antidotes, so I need to practice those, apply them, and see which work for this particular mind. And my set of antidotes aren't going to be yours. Everybody's mind is so different, but we all can find ways to work with these unruly minds and find some peace and decrease our negative karma that we create and tame the mind. And if we do that, then of course we start progressing on the path in a very clear way. And at the end of the day, we can feel pretty good about our practice.